Claire Bravo.
How incredible was that panel, everyone? I mean, are you kidding? They were so good. So we've heard a little bit about what issues are important to Gen Z, and now we're going to dive into how to take all of that energy into action. While we hoped that the presidential candidates could have joined us today, with the debate in 3 days, we were not able to make it, but rest assured, we have 3 extraordinary experts here with us who are going to teach us how to mobilize all this enthusiasm that we just heard into actual change. So, I want to welcome to the stage Roshni Nedangadi, who is the co-founder of HIT Strategies. You guys can clap. Beth Link, Executive Director of When We All Vote. And Sara Mora, immigrant rights activist and digital storyteller. So I want to start with you, Roshni. If you could set the scene a little bit for us, because I mentioned this at the beginning of opening up here, which is there was an interesting data point on the survey which you worked on and helped put everything together on this idea that if you can show young women the connection between the issues that are most pressing to them and how they connect specifically to the impact of women, other women in their community or themselves, that they're more likely to feel like their vote actually matters on election day.
Yeah, I think that this is such an important point, and I wanted to start by saying thank you all so much for having me here. At HIT Strategies, we really focus on talking to groups that we call the emerging electorate. So lots of groups of people of color, young voters, Gen Z, millennials, LGBTQ folks, basically folks who have been marginalized, especially in other research. And we're so blessed to work with organizations like the YWCA, like Justice and Joy, who actually invest in deep oversampling in some of these marginalized communities, because it's so important for us to have a full understanding. When we're talking about young women and Gen Z young women and gender-expansive young folks, it's so important to have this full understanding of what is going on in all of their lives. Especially when Gen Z is our most diverse generation in our nation's history. So I want to take a step back before I answer your question and talk a little bit about what we have seen in some of our qualitative and quantitative work with these young women and young non-binary folks over the last few years, which is this real sense of apathy and cynicism when they're thinking about the government and when they're thinking about voting. And I feel like oftentimes older generations, especially elected representatives and those in government, take that apathy and cynicism to mean that these young folks don't care. And that is so far from the truth. Young people and young women especially care so deeply about the issues that impact them and their communities. They just don't understand necessarily how to connect the issues that are important to them to what action they should take to improve those issues. And that's why we're all here, to talk about how to mobilize these young folks to take action. I think especially important in this idea is that they don't think that the government works for them. And I want to be very clear when I say this. They don't think the government works for them. They are very clear-eyed about the fact that the government works the way it is intended, for the people it is intended to work for. Wealthy folks, old white men, powerful corporations. So they don't see, there's a barrier to entry for young folks and for young voters when that is how they perceive the government, and then they don't understand how exactly to make change within that system. But this gives us a lot of openings to talk about policies in a way that resonate with these young voters. So going back to your question, we talked about, they really think about themselves in community and in relationship with people. And I think that you heard that, especially in this last question with our young panelists, when asked who they vote for, none of them said themselves. And so often when we are talking about, in survey research, we ask a question over and over again, what's the most important issue to you? And of course we asked that in this survey, and our young Gen Z women said that the most important issues to them were the economy, were healthcare, were abortion access. But we took it a step further and asked, what are the most important issues to women? And they had slightly different answers. When we asked this question, what are the most important issues to women, they said domestic violence, abortion access, and childcare. And in fact, when we then tested messages to try and mobilize these young women, the messages that were most resonant for them were ones that centered around policies and actions around domestic violence, around childcare, around abortion access. So young women are thinking about themselves very differently. They're thinking about themselves in the collective. When we ask how they identify themselves, it is in terms of their relationships with others, as a mother, as a sister, as a caregiver, as a wife, and not as individuals. So we need to rethink the way that we're talking about policies and messaging to these young women in order to bring them in and consider their full experiences when we're trying to engage them in voting.
When we talk about messaging and you talk about what's going to propel them to actually come out, you said it best, you know, it's the power of how they think about their vote, or it's the confidence that they feel about the power of their vote. Beth, you've worked for the administration, you have worked on the ground, you know a lot about messaging, right? What works here? How can candidates and leaders be able to fill in that gap between presenting issues and connecting it to communities, which the research already showed us, if women can be connected to how issues affect their communities of other women and themselves, they're more likely to go out and vote.
100%. And I think, you know, I really appreciate you starting and anchoring us in that fallacy, really, that young people don't care. You know, the previous conversation laid that to rest, period, and the data backs that up, that young people are incredibly activated and energized. Women, non-binary people are leading the way when it comes to building our democracy and fighting for democracy that actually serves us. And that is something that we're seeing day in and day out, and it's really the issues that are motivating this generation and young women in particular. When we're having conversations with folks, the things that really resonate and engage are those issues, and it's really first starting with listening and asking, you know, what do you care about? Here's how the systems impact that issue, right? It's engaging in a conversation and really just taking it to basics and really, really listening. The issues that are obviously popping up to the top include abortion, the economic justice, climate change, gun violence, all of the things that you hear day in and day out, but that really anchoring it in what do you care about? How do you engage? Certainly that's something that leaders and organizations and organizers can do, but that's also something each and every one of us can do in the conversations that we're having in our group chats, in direct messages, in casual conversation with family, friends, and community. When we all vote, one of the things that we try and do is provide the tools to be able to take that conversation and casual conversation about what do you care about. Well, you know, this is how not just, you know, the presidential candidate or the Senate or the congressional candidate or even your governor, but here's how your mayor, here's how your city council might impact that issue. Or don't you know, abortion is on the ballot in the form of a ballot measure in, Arizona and any number of other states where it has been added to the ballot to arm us as leaders in our lives and in our communities with those tools so that we can have those conversations and really be those ambassadors day in and day out within our own communities to ignite those conversations, but take it there to then action. So you can sign up for a voter registration portal or utilize the portal that we have in partnership with YWCA to then in that group chat, in that direct message say, okay, and now are you registered to vote? Are you not sure? Just check your voter registration. That's an easy thing to do. And if you're not, then if you're not registered, then there's additional steps. So there's that. So it's one, what do you care about? What are those issues? And then let's talk about action and not leave a wide gap between those issues and the actions and calls to actions that people can take. The last thing I will just say is, more generally, and this is something that's bared out at different points in my career in talking and engaging communities, is that consistently it's really about what's in it for me. How can I help protect myself, my family, and the ones I love and I care about? We are doing that, whether it's, making sure that the resources that are being provided, whether you're from government, from your community, are connected with the action of voting or participating in democracy. So very specifically, many of us have student loan debt. If you're working through that process to either get some relief on that student loan debt, we work on some student loan clinics so that folks can get resources to go through that process to get some of the additional resources that are available to get that relief. At the end of that conversation too, it's about, all right, this is a resource that is helpful, beneficial. Here's a real action you were able to take to help you in your life. Now here's another step that you can take as we look to make sure that we're connecting how you're getting that help, that relief, that support with the steps that you have taken to participate in democracy and make your voice heard. It's not that disconnected, and I think all of us can help close that gap between what seems like sometimes a pretty abstract concept of engaging, voting, and you're like, okay, when am I going to see the results? But sometimes the results are there. It's about us connecting those dots for people.
And I so resonate with what you said about this kind of civic engagement piece. There's so much, I think now, particularly this election cycle, with what I'm seeing on a reporting end from women, that they're not just waiting till election day to think that all of their issues are going to be taken care of. They're thinking about ways of engaging their community now, thinking about how their local leaders are going to make a difference in certain issues like access to abortion again, of course. Sara, I wanna go to you because you have done a really good job as an immigrant right activist and digital storyteller about having these conversations and building community around a topic that is very personal to you. And I want you to get into your story a little bit because you're a DACA recipient, formerly undocumented, just like myself. And you've really been able to galvanize a community of people that might not have felt like there was a community there for them. I can speak for myself, being undocumented, you feel really alone. And you've created a space online to create community of people that are now informed. And you tell us, are they excited about Election Day? Are their friends and families excited for Election Day to help that community? We're talking about immigrant community.
I mean, I can't really speak for everyone. I want to be very clear when I say, I'm one activist, and that's important in the work that I do. To be very specific, one day I got to share my story, and after multiple sharings in different spaces and in different lights and having a passion for communication, I went viral, and I thought about the power of my story because of powerful women around me that said, your story is powerful and it is making a difference. So I don't know about everyone, but I know, we have to be very honest about the election that's coming up and what that means for immigrant communities. Realistically, what's on the table on both presidential candidates is a very harsh reality, right? We're not talking about a clear, comprehensive immigration reform. We're talking about more shadows and more blurred lines and conversations around what undocumented communities look like now. DACA is a temporary status passed in 2012 under the Obama administration. It is the most viral sensation to many because, right, it's DACA dreamers, you're a DACA, and it's important that people got that far to even knowing. But realistically, that's one status out of so many that defines how people migrate and what they get to be categorized under. And that doesn't even really describe the urgency with which they migrate, right? Healthcare is not the same in every country. It's really a desperation for some people to receive healthcare here, but that's really just, again, one issue of the many. And so to answer the question short, I don't think people are excited, but as somebody in immigration reform, I'm not going to measure the room. I'm going to really make sure that I do my best to inform people of what candidates are providing, what they're saying they're going to represent during their presidency, right? We have to make sure our community understands what that means and obviously pick our best. And also, remind them that voting is not the only way we get civically engaged. Local communities don't disappear after elections, and the work that people do, even like at the YWCA, doesn't go away, right? It's 24/7 and it's all the time, and it's really important for things to stay local because a national election happens every 4 years, but that work stays forever, and everybody has to continue to exist. So yeah.
I wonder if that says something about the culture of voting in this community. Like you well said, it's not just about voting on election day, but it's about all of the other things that you do and the organizations that you're a part of and the activism or civic engagement that you have within other communities, right? Not just on election day. For the leaders out there, and I know we're being live streamed and there's some watch parties, leaders like you who feel that may have different stories, that may have the same story as you, what do you think is important for them to know if they want to change the mind of somebody about their story who might not get it or who want to use their story to be able to galvanize change?
Yeah, I would say one day I was a temporary status girl sharing my story before the president of Costa Rica with my mom's encouragement, who's right here. And I was scared, and my mom was like, we're doing this. And like, I did it, but I was scared. I'm like, who am I, right? Why should I do this? What difference is it gonna make? And I don't encourage anyone, I need to be really clear, to expose your status. I do not encourage that. I did that. And that was something that I maybe didn't make as aware as I am now, but I did it with a lot of faith because I believe in Jesus, and I had faith in my heart that I had a purpose sharing my story. And so when I shared my story, I shared it with the desire for this president to know he wasn't here for a hello and a picture. He was here to understand the necessities of this community and to understand the potential of diplomatic communities, because we don't grow up in low-income schools understanding diplomacy. You don't know ambassadors. And when you take a picture out of gratitude because you don't understand what that is. No crecemos entendiendo la diplomacia, ni los embajadores, ni las instituciones de relaciones internacionales, but wealthy families do. And that's not where we stop. We're talking about relationships, government, politics, power, who's elected into our offices in local cities. We don't know that. At least I didn't, and I know my friends didn't either. And so I forgot where we were talking about, but when I first shared my story, I thought nobody was gonna care. And when I worked at a nonprofit, it was really hard because the funding wasn't necessarily allocated for storytellers, right? Mm-hmm. There was a lot more priorities, and so I could have quit a lot of times, but I realized the thing is, like, art and creating is part of the movement. Yes. That was in the civil rights movement. It's in movements across the world. So there is room, and sometimes if the room you're in is not the one that has the room, it doesn't mean your ability to talk a certain way, create a certain way, help others see things in a certain way isn't real. What? Of course it's real. You have a purpose. You are a light. Mm-hmm.
It reminds me what the panel before this said about living in two different worlds and grappling with that in the midst of an election cycle and having to be two things at once. And Roshni, I wonder if you could speak to this, because it reminds me of what they said about the anxiety, right? That they have to be a lot of things at once, that they feel pressure all at once. And I wonder what you have to say about this and how it has an effect on the culture of voting.
Yeah, it's a really difficult thing to try and get to, especially when we're talking in research terms. When we have a survey in the field, we can ask a set of questions that people can give a set of responses to, but it's really important to open those up and talk to people more in a one-on-one setting. And so we do a lot of qualitative work, like focus groups, to sit and talk with young people, with young women, about what's important to them, to figure out the why behind some of this. And a lot of times, going back to my previous response, when we're thinking about this kind of sense of apathy and governments not doing anything, it's when we talk to them about the why, it's because they think that there are just so many problems in the country right now, and they don't see people working to solve those problems in any sort of systemic way or in a way that's relatable or understandable to them. So also, like I was saying, young women really think of themselves in community and their relationship to other people in their community, whether that's their family, whether that's their neighbors, whether that's their friends or folks in their workplace. And so taking on not only the burden of the issues that are really important to them, but taking it on for themselves and for their communities leads to a lot of this kind of anxiety and sort of paralysis as to like, what can I really do about this? These are huge governmental challenges and problems. What can little old me do to solve these problems? And so reframing the way that we talk to these young women, reframing the way that we message them to not talk about individualism and what you can do, but what collectively your community can do and what your community has done to make real change and really impact people's lives is so important. Talking about policies that have passed previously, talking about small measures that can impact people in your community, even talking about the history of voting and the history of protest movements and how those types of movements have created change in the country that was not necessarily overnight, but took a lot of work from a community. Those are really strong messaging frames for young women to step back and think, okay, this doesn't have to all be on my shoulders. We can approach this collectively, and we have approached this collectively and been successful in the past. So hopefully we can see success in the future.
And speaking on these anxieties, Beth, what are some of these strategies out there to help manage election anxiety, if there's such a thing? Yeah. And what opportunities do candidates have?
Yeah, so I think, election anxiety is real, and it's because the issues that are at play that we really care about are so existential and so intertwined with who I am, my dignity, to my ability to control my own body, or my ability to keep myself and my family safe, or to care for my family, and that is so core and very visceral and real. It is not a reason to kind of check out or to disengage. And actually, that's not what we're seeing when we ask people, how are you feeling? When We All Vote, we partnered with Headspace, and we launched a partnership around election anxiety, elections, or politics without panic. And we launched that on the night of the first debate. And we're able to share resources, like simple things that you can do, like meditation, or curtailing your news intake if that really is contributing negatively to your mental health, or a feeling of just a heightened anxiety or paralysis, keeping an eye on and monitoring your social media intake and what that actually is feeling like with yourself, and continually checking in with yourself. But also in that Politics Without Panic resource guide is the fact, and really it bears out in the research, that taking action and making a plan can also be helpful as you are trying to manage those feelings of powerlessness, of my voice might not matter, I'm actually not, those questions of, does it actually matter? Does anyone actually care what I think? The answer is yes, we do. Yes, your voice matters. Yes, you have power and you have value. Here are some of the ways that you can engage. And so filling some of those gaps, and particularly reminding young women, it is surprising to me when I hear again and again that many young women do question, does my voice have power? Is it actually going to matter? Us saying that again and again, one, combats that anxiety that we know is very real, and really encourages folks to make your voice heard and to engage in the process. So there's that. The last thing, and just to say a little bit of a bright spot, we have some new data and polling that we did in partnership with Headspace that'll actually come out this week. But one of the bright spots in that is that overwhelmingly the majority of folks that we surveyed are planning to participate, including 1 in 5 folks who did not vote in previous elections that feel so motivated that they are planning to vote this year.
That's interesting. What is the main root of that new enthusiasm and vigor that they're having now that they didn't have before?
I think this is. I think that there's a few reasons why folks are feeling some of that new energy. One, it's the issues. It's this feeling of I'm voting for myself and I'm voting for my future and my family. I care about issues like abortion, like economic justice, or like gun violence, and I want to make sure that we are seeing a sea change. Very real, these issues are literally on the ballot. I think that's part of it. The second piece of it is really an opportunity, and frankly, to see reflected back at them, well, actually, my voice matters if I'm seeing more representation like myself in politics. See change in terms of who's making these decisions, then maybe my voice actually does matter. In recent elections, we've seen more diverse people in power. I think of Gabe Amo, first Black representative out of Rhode Island. I think of the first Black woman to lead the city of Philadelphia. And there's a myriad of other examples across the country where folks are stepping up and leading to seize those reins and move the ball forward. So I think folks are taking back that power and feeling that vigor.
Fascinating. Looking forward to looking at that poll. Back to this sort of sense of anxiety, marginalized communities obviously bear the burden on this. When you think about mixed status families, when you think about families from an immigration perspective that can't vote, voter disenfranchisement. Sada, your audience, part of your audience doesn't have status, right? When you talk about immigration rights. How do you stay encouraging, right? From a perspective of educating, getting people the education that they need about certain laws or things that are coming up without that feeling of disillusionment that comes from being from a community that can't engage in voting like other communities?
I mean, I feel like by consequence, the work I do is more about information and action than emotion, because realistically, immigration reform hasn't moved at a pace that would be hopeful ever. So then I would really be speaking negatively 24/7. If my poems focused on the status of migration, I would just be crying in my poetry. But like in my work with community and in any space, I try to stick to actions and spaces and real things happening in the moment. And also speaking clearly, because I mean, realistically, because of how long migration has happened, systems have been created to kind of either over-terrorize or badly inform immigrant communities. And then, without even getting to language barriers. So I stay encouraging. I know I have to be, because that's the work. The whole point of the work is to inform updated pieces of information and make sure any partnership I'm part of is actualized information. So people don't think of immigrant communities as these far away, unable to talk people, or as me being the leader of everyone, because there's a lot of leaders doing a lot of variety of things.
Well, on that end, how do you stay positive, right? Because you're part of Gen Z who has a very real stake when it comes to immigration rights, and you're online talking about these issues, informing them with all of the different updates, whether it's DACA, whether it's keeping families together, whether it's all these lawsuits. How do you stay hopeful?
Yeah, I actually just remember that in 2016 that Trump was elected, right? When he was elected into office, a lot of dreamers, like a lot of DACA recipients, varied statuses, we were advocating on Capitol Hill for immigration reform. We were literally knocking on the doors of our congresspeople to advocate for better. And I was really scared that we were going to be deported. And the reality is a lot of communities were broken down by ICE and families were deported. And so the way that I take care of myself as somebody with a responsibility in different platforms is I am going back to school and I'm at the gym every day if I can be. And I do these things for myself, right? It's not connected to, in the beginning I was like, this is for my people. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to take a step back and really just do this for myself. But I was saying it with an intention when I said this is for my community, because I'm like, what mentor am I gonna be if I'm literally always tired and anxious? And it's like, why? Because I'm in work that is always moving.
Yeah.
And so when I did like the gym and school, it was ways of taking back things that I wanted to do, but felt like there was no room to do in a really urgent changing country. And so I hope that by doing that, I really think I can help other youth and people believe in their ability to dream, because that's a dream too, finishing school and going to the gym and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Just one thing on that, and because we were having this conversation about anxiety and how to manage it, I think what you just shared is so.
I'm also in therapy. Sorry to cut you off. Like my
school
pays for therapy, so I'm like, what? Free therapy? Like therapy is expensive. So I'm in therapy every week, and I really feel like in my personal relationships, I strive to encourage it. But our communities, at times, it could be complicated to talk about therapy. It's like, you're trying to call me crazy, and it's like, so that is something that's a bridge to get to at some point.
Yeah, I was just going to say that as movement leaders, and I think for everyone here in the room and who's listening, we can feel selfish if it's like, I'm going to take time for myself. I'm going to, take a step back, take that run in the morning, take a break. You have to in order to actually do the work and do the work long term too.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I want to pivot to social media in this last few section of time that we have. Roshni, I want you to sort of contextualize for us this bit of information on the survey about the fact that Gen Z suffer double the amount of online harassment than any other generation. Why is this happening?
The short answer is that Gen Z is just online more, but it is a really staggering number. I think it was 12% of women overall in our survey reported that they experienced online harassment in the last 12 months, and 26% of Gen Z women. This is like 1 out of every 4 Gen Z women has experienced harassment online in the last 12 months. It's a factor of them being online more and having all of their relationships and community being online as well. I think you were saying in the last panel, I myself, being a millennial, had the privilege of growing up without social media.
Yeah.
And so my communities and relationships were not on social media. But I've talked to a number of young folks who work at HIT and my cousins and family, and their entire relationships and systems of community are online. And so they're just experiencing it more there. And it's something that we don't talk about enough, but it is so important, just as we're trying to decrease levels of harassment out in the real world, talking face to face, people to people. We should be putting the same focus on decreasing levels of harassment online.
And I wonder, Roshni, if any of this has to do with the fact that there's so many issues that feel so real to people, and we see people talk over each other all the time. Whether it's the war in the Middle East, whether it's immigration, right? There's some strong words being shared. And part of it, I wonder if it's the inability to communicate language in a way that gives dignity to communities of color. Sara, I think about the post that you did, which I talk all the time about. I work, I used to work at a news organization, thinking about the word, for example, illegal immigrants. Mm-hmm. And you made a wonderful post about explaining why this word is horrific and why we should use, a different identifier. It almost seems nonsensical for you to explain why, but explain why, and kind of if you can touch on the context of why is that important for all of these things in terms of online harassment and dignifying communities of color, especially as we go into an election year. We're there,
yeah.
An election cycle, yeah.
Yeah, I think when we think of the power of language, it could be thought of in so many ways. So like the word illegal was coined at a certain time. It wasn't always like that. there was a time where people that were immigrants were called undocumented because they didn't have documents. And that word did get coined and it stuck. And now it's a leading word aside from borders, conversations, and everything. And on top of the fact that there's language barriers for immigrant communities, this word illegal literally is taking a big percentage of the country. We're not 50%, but I'm pretty sure immigrants, I don't know the number of how much immigrants there are in the country, but immigration is not stopping. I do know in numbers it's a steady reality, and like I'm smiling, but really I'm just like, oh my God, the word illegal has the power to literally take a person from seeing somebody as a human to a product in seconds. And so if just this room decided and felt convicted in their minds to be like, I'm not using that word no more, because wow, that really does make people go from products to, from people to products. That would change 50% more people. And sometimes I feel like my passion with words is that the fact that you could change one word, you could change perception. When you start to see somebody as undocumented, you might ask yourself the question, how and why and when, but in all these things, and that's what, in my opinion, those in power don't want us to do. Because if we ask how and why and when, we realize the people next to us do have commonalities. I didn't say we're identical, but we do have commonalities. And so I even started a campaign online to try to think of radio personalities that are part of these conversations, that make sure we're checking people that want to be checked, or even those who don't, to think about that word illegal and how it completely desensitizes people to the reality of humans migrating at all urgency levels, because migration cannot be defined by one person interviewed. And that is the problem. That is the difficult part, but that is all communities.
It also makes me think about our previous panel when we talk about language and communities of color and the word erasure. That comes up when you use words like this. Beth, I'd love to see if you have any advice, as many of us go online and want to talk about communities, whether they represent our own or whether it's communities that are important to us through our networks, on language, on how to articulate effectively about marginalized communities and their needs.
Absolutely. And I think, whenever there is language that erases our individualism or erases our humanity or disrespects us, we have to be alert and we have to be on guard, and we have to actively be pushing against that. As someone who my ancestors were slaves, my ancestors desegregated schools in Detroit and were called out of their names or were dehumanized in a very systemic and clear way. And that's something that we continue to fight against. We have to be on guard, always. As we think very specifically about how we can do that actively, there's very clear language, like not using the word illegal and using that as a term. But also think about issues that we talk about. So if you're talking about crime and criminals, who are you talking about? What do you mean? Can we talk about public safety? Can we talk about the issue and the solution in the future that we're going to be looking toward? Can we talk about everyone actually being safe from any kind of violence, right? So, I think that it's going a bit deeper and taking another layer. The second part of this, I think, just to take it a bit wider, is an opportunity to think about misinformation and how we engage online. So, we hear a lot about disinformation. Disinformation is that willful inserting of bad information to move specific groups in one way or another, to move you away from voting, to move you away from the resources that you need. But misinformation can be just as insidious, which is just bad information percolating, or bad language percolating and spreading and going wider. So one of the things that we really focus on at When We All Vote is making sure that we have very easily digestible, clear language and tools and messaging on social media where young people live. The vast majority of young people in Gen Z spend a very significant amount of time online. About half of the group though, is saying, hey, I'm actually not getting information about voting and about democracy online and in those spaces that I'm showing up. And particularly, maybe not necessarily information that I can trust. So our team spends a lot of time researching, making sure that those dates and deadlines are correct, how you can request your voter absentee or an early voting process, and information about issues is information that you can lean on. So for everyone here, share that information, because even if you feel like you're seeing it a lot, other people in your group may not. So share that information and share that. And then again, be on guard for information that doesn't look quite right or that looks inaccurate, even from sources you might trust. There are some examples where the state of New York had some language around or polling locations and same-day voter registration that was incorrect. They corrected it and it got out, but just be mindful and be on guard.
And that's a really important thing, especially when you talk about the discourse online and so many issues that charge the emotions of people, and your instinct is to immediately share, right? And I wonder if you have any tips for those Gen Z leaders out there who want to be a part of being more of an educator on certain issues. What is your advice on a gut check when it comes to misinformation or disinformation and sharing online?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I will, say is know your sources and know resources and organizations that you can lean on. Obviously, the YWCA is an incredible resource for voter education and resources about the issues that are top of mind. Obviously, at When We All Vote, you can come. We have those shareable explainers and resources and talking points. We also have weall.vote/public, which is a resource of a myriad of voter hub information in terms of those dates and deadlines, or why we vote topics around different issues for different states and topics that you might care about. So that's one, right? Just take know your sources, have a cadre of organizations or entities that you can really rely on. The second thing, though, and I think, I'm just really grateful to you for sharing your story and the power of your voice, but also grounding us at the beginning about the power of storytelling. It's not just about, parroting or sharing the same content over and over again. Yes, that is helpful, and we know, a mode of communication is that repetition helps cement information. But it is also about telling your why and getting that, reputable and accurate information, and then pairing that with your story. What do you care about? That might also inspire people in your network to do the same, to share what they care about and pass it on. So that would be the two things I would say there.
We're out of time, but I do want to do just a quick rapid fire in a few words. There's so much change that I feel that people are now energized to go and do. What is your one or two pieces of advice on mobilizing these issues to action? Roshni, do you want to go first?
Sure. I would say focus the message and be as specific as possible to the audience that you're speaking to. So actually do the research, find out what is important to the young women that you're talking to, what issues are important, what they care about, what their values are, who in their community they're advocating for, and speak to them about those issues. Because the more that they can connect their political behavior, including voting, to seeing direct change, the more that they will be activated and participate.
Sarah?
I don't know. I was still trying to think. Sorry, that was fast.
Oh no. You have such a big platform. You've been able to amplify so much educational pieces, and I think, again, we're having a watch party across the nation here of Gen Z leaders that look to you and say, how can I do that? How can I use my story? How can I use my voice and use social media as a tool to amplify that?
Yeah, I would say don't wait for everyone to support it. Like, that's something really important. If it's a particular policy or a particular action, kind of just like be the leader for that cause before anyone else does. And don't be surprised that people care and like people really do want to do something about it. There's just a lot of issues, especially thinking of the internet. I think it could be easy to get overwhelmed and be like, oh my God, there's so much to fight for.
Yeah.
Where do I even start? Like,
Right.
I'm tired just looking at all this information. So being realistic about a few action calls that people can take to the issue you're representing, I feel like is something that helps me a lot.
Beth?
You are the next generation of voters. You are you are the next generation of voters. Be brave. You don't have to do it alone. Lean on your community, and we will all reap the benefits.
I just want to say thank you three so much for this panel. Let's give it up for them. I appreciate each and every one of you. And I just want to say a shout out to the YWCA for having me here today. I've been working with them pretty closely these last few weeks, and I'm so glad that I have, because the work that you're doing is really changing the way that we view ourselves, our power, and the ability to create change for others. So let's give it up for the YWCA one more time. And to close this afternoon's town hall, please welcome back to the stage YWCA's Melissa Gillum and from Justice and Joy Collaborative, Addison Moore.